We're going to read the books of Jonah and Ruth, along with the passage in Third Isaiah that we looked at last time, as examples of resistance, as examples of standing against a particular way of understanding identity along narrowly genealogical and culturally homogeneous grounds. To refresh your memory, in the book of Ezra finds out that the Israelites have been marrying women who are not part of the approved genealogical line, and he decides to appease God's sense of purity by sending away the wives and the children who are not part of Israel's, quote, holy seed. I contrasted that with the passage in Isaiah 56, which is from more or less the same time period, in which the prophet says, don't let any of the foreigners think that God was trying to separate them from his people. Rather, if they are worshiping the Lord, if they are keeping the covenant, then they are welcome among the midst of the people of Israel. And I presented this as a kind of cultural clash, a cultural conflict between different ways of understanding identity and identity formation and boundaries and the maintenance of social identity boundaries. The perspective taken in Third Isaiah, in Isaiah 56, the prophetic view, which challenges narrow definitions of identity along genealogical or family or geographical or cultural bounds, is seen as well in a few other passages, including in the books of Jonah and in Ruth. In Jonah, what we find is that God shows through the character of Jonah and the conflict or the tension or the contrast between Jonah and the other characters in the story that God has concern for the whole world and not just for the one group that we identify as Israel. And in the book of Ruth, we find that those who are from the outside, who are not part of the genealogically pure group, are considered to be worthy of full inclusion. I'm going to unpack each of those relatively quickly in this video. We'll start here in the book of Jonah. First of all, the way we read the story is as a parable in which the story of the prophet is told in a very stereotypical way. It's a fantastical story that is not rooted in reality, but rather is meant to make a theological point. This is a point that concerns some people. They want to argue very strongly that Jonah is historically accurate, that these things happen, that Jonah was a real prophet, and I don't really see the need to argue that point in any detail. We're going to choose to read this passage today as a parable, as a story that is told for a particular theological purpose and not one that's describing anything that actually happened. So we find out that there's this prophet named Jonah, and God appears to him and says, go to Nineveh. This is the capital of the nation of Assyria, who had been, in the 8th century BCE, Israel's great enemy and the imperial overlord of most of the Mesopotamian world. Jonah says, no, I'm not going to Nineveh. So he went in the opposite direction, going generally due west instead of east to get to Nineveh. But instead, God sends a great storm that causes the ship to be threatened. Now here's our first contrast. The mariners in this passage are not Israelites, they are foreigners. And when the storm comes up, then they all start beseeching their God. Each cried to his God. They are not only praying, but they are also working to alleviate the concern. That seems to me to be a problem faced by many religious people who think that praying is all they need to do when really they need to be, socially isolating and wearing face masks. They threw the cargo into the sea and they were working really hard. Meanwhile, Jonah is asleep in the hold of the ship. And the captain comes down and says, what are you doing? Try to call on your God. Maybe, perhaps, the God will spare us so that we will not perish. Well, then they decide, let's find out what's actually causing this. They cast lots, which is a form of divination, and the lot falls on Jonah. And they say to Jonah, what, why, you're responsible for this. And he says, well, okay, here's what it is. I am fleeing from the presence of the Lord, and the Lord is the God of heaven, the one who made the sea and the dry land, and God is doing this to us. Now, at that point, I think they could be forgiven for being a little bit vindictive to Jonah, for not beseeching his God earlier, for not helping, for being responsible for the situation. But instead, they show a basic human kindness toward Jonah. He tells them, "Throw me into the sea, and then you'll be fine." He is in the pits of despair. He is petulant. He is passive aggressive. He is not a very likable character in this story. But the men, the sailors, instead of throwing him overboard, say, "No, we're going to try to save the ship." And they try very hard to bring the ship to land, and they're working and working and working because they do not want to kill Jonah. And finally, they realize that there's no other recourse. And so they pray to the Lord. They pray to God. "Do not let us perish on account of this man's life. You're responsible. Basically, God, this is your deal, and this is all we can do. Don't hold us responsible." And then the men, after they threw him overboard, the sea calms, and then the men feared the Lord even more, offered a sacrifice, and made vows. So this is a kind of testament to their spiritual sensitivity, to their openness to divine truths, and their basic moral orientation to the world. They are the good guys. They are the heroes in this story. And Jonah is, in comparison, not an attractive character. He is disobeying God. He is petulant. He is self-centered. He's not doing anything to help. And Jonah is compared to these mariners, really not a very attractive character. Now, the fish that swallows Jonah is a narrative technique. It is a device in the story to get Jonah from one place to another place. It might have said that Jonah grabbed on a piece of wood and God sent a wind and it blew the wood back to the seashore. Or there was some passing ship that picked him up and carried him back to the shore. I don't know. I mean, there's any number of ways that he could have gotten from this middle of the ocean back to the shore, and this is the way that it is told. Because the fish here, we use whale. There's a little side story here, which is that the Hebrew word for fish is dog, and it's called a dog gadol, a big fish. There's no word for whale in Hebrew. It's just a large fish. There's nothing important to the story about the fish other than the fish gets Jonah from one place to another place. If we're arguing about the fish, then I think we're missing the point. Jonah, brought to the shore by the fish, then hears the word of the Lord a second time saying, "Go to Nineveh." And he's like, "Okay, fine, I'll go do it." Now, when he gets to Nineveh, first of all, it's described as a city of 3 days walk across, which is much bigger than Nineveh was. You can see that it's a larger than life. It's a very stylized, very exaggerated story. And the message that he gives is 40 days more and Nineveh shall be overthrown. That's the message. He is not offering them hope. He is not saying, if you repent, if you believe God, unless you turn to God, then you will, right? This is just a simple announcement of God's judgment, of God's intervention. That's the word we used when we talked about the prophets. The people believed God, proclaimed a fast, and everyone was going into mourning, going into supplication. The king heard it, same thing, said, "Here's my decree. Everyone is going to mourn, to be covered with sackcloth, and to cry mightily to God. Even animals are going to have on sackcloth." And the reasoning that God has the reasoning that the king has is really important. He says, "Who knows? God may relent and change his mind. He may turn from his fierce anger so that we do not perish." He's not saying that if we repent, then we will be saved. He says, who knows? Maybe God will save us. If we do this thing that we think will make God happy, maybe he will look on us with favor and we won't receive the judgment that has been announced, that has been promised. Maybe. Who knows? So again, the king of Assyria. This is the prototypical bad guy. The king of Assyria is supposed to be the evil one in this story. And instead, like the mariners, he's sensitive, he is open, he is faithful, prayerful, he learns, he turns to God, right? He is the good guy as opposed to Jonah, who has been shown to be the bad guy. Not the bad guy in a nefarious sense, but he is clearly the less attractive character in the story compared with the pagan sailors, compared with the pagan king, the king of Israel's hated enemy. The Assyrians are the ruthless bastards, and they hated them. So when God saw that all that they were doing, he decided not to do the judgment. So it turns out that the emergency declarations of the king were successful, and God decided not to send the punishment that he had put Jonah through a tremendous amount of trouble to show up to give, but now has decided not to do it. Again, this is very important that you realize it's not that the preaching was repent or you will be destroyed. They repented, therefore they weren't destroyed. That is not the preaching. The preaching was you are about to be destroyed. And the people were like, well, we have no other choice but to ask for mercy, knowing that God is free, knowing that God is in charge, and maybe God will show us mercy. And as it turns out, God, in this case, did show mercy. To whom did God show mercy? The hated, villainous, barbarous, violent Assyrians. This angers Jonah to no end. He became angry. And he says to God, is this not what I said before I even came over here? I knew that you are a gracious God and merciful, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love, and ready to relent from punishing. Now, let me die. The text that Jonah quotes here is a text that appears in a handful of places in the Bible, and it is a classic doxology. It is a classic statement of praise for God's virtues, and it shows up in Exodus in the Sinai scene for the first time. That God is a gracious God and merciful and slow to anger and abounding in chesed, abounding in steadfast love. This is a positive statement about God's mercy, that he punishes for a time but shows mercy and faithfulness to 1,000 generations. Here, Jonah takes that positive affirmation of God's mercy and turns it into an accusation. As regards our enemies, as regards the Assyrian God, I knew you were not tough enough and mean enough and ruthless enough to do the hard thing, to go through with it, to destroy these wicked people. I knew that you were gracious and merciful. You were weak. Now think about the dynamics of this idea, this identification of strength with vindictiveness and of mercy with weakness. That our enemies deserve our scorn, they deserve our pain, they deserve punishment, they should get what they deserve. And when we see our enemies not suffering the punishment they so richly deserve, then we are irritated, we are frustrated, we are angered like Jonah. So Jonah is the character, as the main character of the story, who is supposed to be us as we follow through the story. We are to identify with Jonah and to recognize that same emotion in our heart which says we want God to smash our enemies. We want God to be faithful to us, God's own people, and to show judgment on those who have hurt us in the past. But God's response to Jonah is very important. God says, look, why are you so angry? Jonah then goes down to the city and sits down and waits to see what's going to happen. God then sends a vine. It grows up and it covers Jonah and it shelters him for a while from the sun. And then the next day, God sends a worm and it kills the bush. And then that makes Jonah even more upset. And he says, he's asking again to die. And God says, is it right for you to be angry about the bush? This is the quote. This is the same thing that God is asking about the city. Is it right for you to be angry? is it right for you to be angry? In this case, about the bush. And he said, yes, angry enough to die. And God's response is very important. He says, look, you're worried about this bush. You didn't make it. It was here for a while. Now it's gone. Who cares? But you're so upset about this bush that you shouldn't even care about. Should I not be concerned about Nineveh, that great city in which there are more than 120,000 people who are so confused, and also all the animals? That's the end of the book. It ends on a rhetorical question. And that rhetorical question becomes the question to us. Should God not be concerned about all the world? All the people in the world? And all the ways in which they are confused and hurting? All the ways in which they are wrong or right? And also about all of the animals? The reference to the animals here, I think, is a really interesting ecological little flourish in the story. The fact is that war and destruction and violence is hard not only on people, but also on the environment and on the animals, the ones that suffer when armies come through and kill and burn and slash and maim everything in their path. So the text, the story here, is a story that challenges the narrow definitions of care and concern, the narrow definitions of who is God's people. And instead, by showing us the contrast between a prophet who is supposed to be God's man and these pagans, quote unquote, the sailors and the Assyrians, are villainous enemies of all people, by showing this contrast that says, no, these are the good characters, and Jonah is the weak, and Jonah is the problematic character. It challenges our own prejudices, our own ideas about what should God be concerned about. So I think that the book of Jonah is similar to Isaiah 56 when it raises the question that foreigners can also be included in the covenant, that God's concern extends beyond the normal boundaries of Israel, defined narrowly through the people group of Israel, geographical or genealogical. In the book of Ruth, we find a story about an Israelite man who goes to Moab because of a famine. He and his wife and his 2 sons. And when he's in Moab, his 2 sons take wives, and then the husband and both sons die. And the people who are left are the mother-in-law and the 2 daughters-in-law, Naomi, Ruth, and Orpah. The mother-in-law, Naomi, tells the daughters-in-law, look, you're young women. You need to just leave me, go find new men to marry, and just start over. Orpah does leave, but then Ruth pledges to stay with Naomi. In Ruth, there's this famous passage where Ruth says, no, I'm not going to leave you. Do not make me leave you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And then Ruth makes a covenantal pledge to Naomi. May the Lord do thus and so to me, and more as well, if even death parts me from you. The idea is that if I break this agreement, if I break this covenant with you, then I am calling upon God's judgment on me. She is covenantally binding herself to her mother-in-law, to Naomi. So the 2 of them, now Naomi and Ruth, come back to Israel. And there is this long story that you're probably familiar with about Naomi trying to help Ruth find a husband who is going to marry her, and then in doing so redeem the property, inheritance, possession, family line of the line of Elimelech and his sons who have now died. So it's right in the wheelhouse of that story in Ezra about the problem of transference of property and transference of right and inheritance through father and son. Now the father and son are both gone. Where does the inheritance go? And the argument is that if this man who's related can marry Ruth, then through their sons, the line of that man will then be continued. This is called Levirate marriage. Here's the thing. The Levirate marriage in this case is coming through marriage to Ruth a Moabite woman. If you remember in Deuteronomy 23, the Moabites and the Ammonites are the two groups that are specifically forbidden from entering into the temple or for being part of God's people. For 10 generations, for 500 years, no Moabite is allowed to be part of God's people. But here we have an affirmation of Ruth as spiritually sensitive, as open, as faithful, and who is being brought into the story. And her marriage to Boaz then is seen as an incredibly positive development. So Boaz goes to the elders and he tells the elders, look, I'm getting ready to marry Ruth, and I'm acquiring now from Naomi everything that belonged to Elimelech and Chilion and Machlon, the two sons. And I've acquired Ruth the Moabite, the wife of Machlon, to be my wife, to maintain the dead man's inheritance, in order that the name of the dead may not be cut off from his kindred and from the gate of his native place. Today you are witnesses. He is extending and preserving the line of Elimelech and Machlon through this marriage to Ruth. And they're all said, okay, excellent. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. Can a woman in the Hebrew Bible be praised in higher language than to say, may she be like Rachel and Leah, who built up the house of Israel, producing children, extending the line, right, building the family. This is genealogical. This is family. This is people. This is the covenantal community, right? This is the heart of Israel's identity. But Ruth, Moabite. So he marries Ruth. She eventually has a son whom they named Obed. And the son of Obed was Jesse. And the son of Jesse was David. So Ruth becomes great-grandmother to King David himself. I interpret this story not in the period of the Judges where it is set, but in the period of the post-exile, which I believe it is talking about, which is a rejection of the marriage policies laid out in the book of Ezra. Instead of saying that these women from foreign communities need to be excluded and rejected, instead, Ruth is a story in which the woman who's the foreigner is brought into the community and is glorified because of her faithfulness and her general goodness, her sense of humanity. Right? She's a praiseworthy woman. And in this way, I would argue that both of these books, Jonah and Ruth, dating more or less to the post-exilic period, challenge some of the attitudes that were developing in that time period that were exclusionary and prejudicial against people with non-knowable or undefined genealogical roots.